G'day, Ember Fest. So yeah, today we're going to talk about render modifiers. So Glimmer components have a much more simplified component model than classic components did, and render modifiers were created as a bridge between the two worlds to make migrating from classic to Glimmer much easier. However, they're considered an anti-pattern these days, but it's not immediately clear what the alternatives are. So I just want to quickly look at the history of render modifiers, why they're there, and what the alternatives are in a post-render modifier world. So that's kind of a summary of the talk. So I'm Aaron. I work at Intercom, work in the front-end tech team, and we're all about enabling the engineers. So I get to do loads of pairing and educating of our product teams, which is awesome. And I recently got my first Intercard a few weeks back, so that was pretty cool. So the inspiration for this talk was from a lot of the conversations I've had in these pairing sessions around render modifiers, and specifically the README of the repo. So can I see a show of hands of who uses render modifiers or has a code base that has them in them, just so I can see? All right, most people, okay. So there's a few parts in this README. This was updated a while back, and there's a few points in here that kind of inspired me for this talk and the conversations I've had. And basically, you can sort of see here, we strongly encourage you to rethink your functionality rather than use these modifiers. These hooks can be rewritten as custom modifiers, revisit your design if custom modifiers aren't a good fit. And then use these modifiers with caution. They're generally an anti-pattern. But what it doesn't do is kind of sort of tell you what to do instead. And I know there was a lot of time around data loading and fetching. There wasn't really a clear path forward. So this is hopefully a talk that can make that clearer. So for people that don't know what modifiers are, real quick 101. They're basic primitives for interacting with DOM elements in Ember, and they appear inside free floating curlies inside an element's opening tag, like the on input there, which you are more than likely familiar with because it ships with Ember. They're basically functions that get past the actual DOM element when the modifier is attached to that element, as you can see there. So yeah, this is what like the on modifier, a basic implementation of it could look like. So you can kind of see the function gets past the element you've attached it to, and we can add an event listener. So that's one you've likely used a lot. And modifiers come from the Ember modifier package. So the goal for this talk is to look at what render modifiers are and why they exist, and why are they discouraged these days, and what are the alternatives. And I actually forgot to, yeah, anyway, cool. There we go. I should follow my notes. So before we do that, we'll quickly look at the history of why they're there. For people that are new to Ember or have really only used Octane, this might give you a little bit of historical context of where we come from. So Glimmer components were released in 3.15. Before that, we had classic components. I kind of tried to look at the source code. I think they were introduced in 1.0.0 RC6. Could be completely wrong, but they've been there for a while. Basically, classic components had quite a complex or complicated life cycle. They exposed a number of life cycle hooks that you could hook into to run code at various stages within that component's life cycle. So you can see there's a whole bunch of them there. And to complicate things, different hooks run at different times. So an initial render of a component, you could write code in the init, did receive adders, will render, did insert element, did render hooks, and do things at those various places. And when the component was re-rendered, there's a different set of hooks, some the same as initial render, some different. And then when the component's destroyed, you could hook into when will destroy and did destroy. So there's a lot of places to hook into the lifecycle, which is great. And what sorts of things would we do? Like generally, I'd see these hooks being used, kind of a subset of them, for things like initializing a third-party library like Full Calendar or Popper.js, or adding event listeners like resizing or scrolling, and also data loading, fetching data, and maybe even refetching data when something happens. Maybe infinite scroll, we got to the bottom, we want to refetch data. Then enter Glimmer components, which have a much more simplified component model. There's no more numerous lifecycle hooks. We just have will destroy, and then the constructor. It's just the JavaScript constructor. So the paradigm shifted quite a lot here. We're not any longer thinking in terms of component life cycles. And the gap becomes clear. How do I migrate quickly from my classic component to a Glimmer component? Because I want to start using the newer stuff. It's not really immediately obvious. So That's where render modifiers came in. They were created as a bridge between the two worlds to allow us all to easily or quickly, relatively, get to Glimmer components, to not have to change our classic components too much. So where we might have implemented the did_insert element hook, we could basically use the did_insert render modifier and call that function, and it wouldn't change that much. Same with did_update adders and will_destroy element. So that's why they're here. But we've moved past there. So we're just going to look at the three common scenarios that are kind of covered. Initializing an add-on or a plugin or a library, adding event listeners, and data fetching. So there's going to be a bunch of code. I hope you can see it okay on here. So we'll start with initializing a library. So let's start with what it would look like before, with classic components, before render modifiers. Imagine we've got a component here that we're going to turn a div into a calendar using the full calendar library, for instance, something I've done in a previous project. So we have a component, extends Ember component, so a classic component. Can you see the code okay? Cool, all right. We're implementing the did_insert element hook, which will run when the component's inserted into the DOM, and we're initializing the calendar on line 11 there. Interestingly, note that we're passing in this.element because classic components by default have like a DOM element that comes with them that it's attached to, and you can reference it in classic components by this.element. This doesn't exist in Glimmer components. Foreshadowing. We're also implemented the will_destroy element hook to tear down the calendar. So how do we migrate this thing to Glimmer components? This is how you might have done it with render modifiers. So it's largely the same. Let's look closer. You can see we're extending Glimmer component now. But we've had to add a template, which we didn't have before, to give us a div element to anchor our modifiers onto, because remember, modifiers are attached to a DOM element. That DOM element was kind of implicit with classic components, but doesn't exist with Glimmer components. So we've had to go and add this div just so that we can use the render modifiers. A little bit of a smell there. And also the setup and teardown is not grouped together, which is a little bit of a problem. These two things kind of need to happen together. They're logically grouped, but we now need to have two different modifiers running. They're sort of separated. So these are some of the downsides. One of the good things is that when modifiers, when you pass it a function, it gets the element passed to it. So we don't need to use like this.element. We're actually getting past the element. So that's a good thing. Here's another smell. Destroy calendar. The function that we're using gets past the element because it's being passed into a modifier. We don't actually use it. Maybe it starts to suggest that maybe this is not the right thing to use. So you can see here, like we have an unnecessary DOM element we needed to create. The setup and the teardown and the calendar aren't logically grouped together. And it's a bit of a smell. That's the way why it's not the best approach. So what's the modern alternative? Custom modifiers. They're really, really easy to build. So you can imagine in this case, we don't even need a full calendar component anymore. We can kind of just have a modifier. So no need for the component. The element that we attach the modifier to is passed to the modifier. And we can attach this DOM element to any element now. So we can turn anything we like. We can reuse it. We can attach it to any DOM element. It's easily shareable. And so this modifier now has encapsulated that logic. This encapsulated the logic to create a calendar and to destroy it and tear it down. With modifiers, if you return a function, it'll run that when the modifier is removed. So we've grouped the setup and the teardown. So custom modifiers for the win when you want to do DOM interactions. What have we learned from this? When interacting with DOM elements, use custom modifiers. I'm repeating myself, which is always good. So let's look at adding and removing event listeners. Imagine a component that registers some sort of event listener, maybe on scroll or on resize. This one's my cheese component. Did insert element. We saw that in the last one. we're going to hook into when the component is inserted into the DOM. And we're going to add the event listener for the scroll. And then we want to clean up afterwards, so will destroy element is a good hook for that. No need for HTML elements at this point, because we're putting the event listers on the document. Now with render modifiers, this is what it looks like. Again, we've got our extra div. We had to create it so we could attach the render modifiers to it. The setup and tear down, again, isn't really grouped. We want these two things to kind of be logically grouped together, because when we add the event listener, we need to make sure we remove it as well. The implementation is relatively untouched, which is great. That was the whole point of render modifiers, right? Is to make it easy to go from classic components to Glimmer components. We didn't actually really need to do anything. We could even leave the functions called the same thing. Did insert element, will destroy element. Just pop the add action on top. So render modifiers did help to bridge that gap. However, you can see again, well, I haven't actually got it in the code, but the element is passed into each of those functions and it's not used. It's a bit of a signal for us. So yeah, we've got the unnecessary DOM elements to set up and tear down isn't logically grouped together, and the unused elements being passed in. These are all kind of signals as to why this is an anti-pattern. So the alternative here could look something like this. We can actually not use modifiers or anything. We could if we wanted to, but we don't have HTML anymore. We're going to use just the constructor of the component. We can set up the event listeners. Instead of relying on the life cycles, we can use register destructible. And so this is in the Ember destroyable package. It allows us to basically say when this particular object is destroyed, run this function. So this is great because we're now packaging together those, logically grouping those two things, adding the event listener and removing it explicitly. So it doesn't have to be a component. If we had a component with DOM elements in the HTML we wanted to kind of add event listeners to, we could have a modifier as well. It would work. It's just another example. So you can see in this way, again, we didn't have to create any extra DOM elements just so that we could attach the render modifiers, registering the destructor instead of relying on the life cycles. We're encapsulating the behavior in a logical package. So when adding, removing event listeners, use components constructor and register a destructor function. We could use a custom modifier as well. So the final scenario is fetching data. This one was always a little funny. There's been various ways to do this over times. The root fetches the data, having sort of wrapper provider components, and nothing really felt right to me. There's always been problems with these, but I think we're starting to settle on a good approach here. So this is an example, roughly illustrates something I've seen, like we have in the Intercom code base loosely. But imagine a component that renders a list of conversations for a particular inbox. That's our sort of scenario here. It might look like that, where we pass in an inbox as an argument. We might have just like a simple template. It just loops over the conversations and prints them out. If there aren't any, then we get no conversations. It's a pretty contrived example, but just humor me. You get the point. So here you can see we might use the init function to go and fetch those initial conversations. The component's just been initialized, so go and fetch that first list of conversations. Could use a task here, probably should, but for simplicity, I'm just making a fetch request. And then on did update adders, imagine the user went and selected a new inbox. We want to go and fetch the list of conversations for that new inbox. So the argument over on the left-hand side here has changed. We want to go and make that call again. So we'd use did update adders for that. Then we have a computer property here to reactively return the conversations after they were updated. So let's look at the render modifier version of that. Again, we have an extra div that we've wrapped around. So that's kind of, we've been through that 3 times now. So it doesn't need to be there. We have the unused element argument here. Suggests that modifiers aren't the greatest for this. And we have 2 modifiers calling the same function. It just kind of feels a bit weird. And the whole idea of the did update one is we need to pass the inbox in, because that's what tells did update when the inbox changes. Then I want to recall that function. So it's all just feeling a little smelly. Yeah, and also the fetch conversations is eagerly fetched. So this is a little contrived, but you can see here, say we had some sort of logic that sort of minimized the list. It's not actually shown. We don't necessarily want to pay the cost for fetching those conversations at that point. However, with the render modifiers, they're going to be fetched regardless of whether the list is shown or not. So it's eagerly fetched, which, maybe we don't want that to be the case. So using render modifiers for this sort of scenario, we got the unnecessary DOM element where the fetching and refetching is not logically grouped together. And we have the unused DOM elements being passed in, and it's eagerly fetched when, why should we pay the cost when we don't need to? So this is where resources come in. They're a great way to encapsulate this behavior. So you can see we don't have the unnecessary div anymore, and there's no modifiers needed at all. The fetch conversations behavior is encapsulated inside a resource. So there's no separate fetch conversations initially and then fetch it afterwards. Resources are reactive, which means they'll be re-executed every time the inputs change. In this case, it's the inbox that's passed into the component. Every time that changes, this thing will refire. So we don't have to separate that idea of initial fetch and then refetch. And they're lazy loaded as well. So in this case, if list is minimized is true, then we won't make the request at that point. It's only at the point that the resource is being requested and accessed that it's going to fire off. So we could use a task resource here. There's a few different types of resources. You would probably have something on the UI where you want to sort of say is loading conversations or whatever, and you could look at that derived state using a task. But again, for simplicity, we're just using a function here. So resources allow us to not need that unnecessary DOM element. It bundles the behavior into a shareable resource that could be imported in other places that need to use conversation list. They're reactive and they're lazily loaded as well. So prefer resources which are reactive and lazily execute and encapsulate behavior that are easily shareable. If you want to see more about resources and if you're not using them yet, Nullvox Popularize Ember resources is the place to go for that. He writes a lot of great stuff about this topic. So a quick recap. Render modifiers, they're intended as a bridge between the classic component world and the Glimmer component world. That was their rationale for being. It doesn't necessarily apply today. You probably see it in your code, think this is what I need to do when things get updated, but just remember the reason they're there and if that's the case. Now, there are three main use cases that I've seen them be used in and continue to be used in, and it's when interacting with DOM elements, adding and removing event listers and fetching data. So instead of using render modifiers for DOM interactions, prefer custom modifiers, prefer the component constructor and register destructor for adding and removing event listeners, or custom modifiers, and resources for fetching data. But do you have to remove them? No. This is one way to write your code and solve the problem, and the projects will still work. But remember, for the reason that they exist, and modern approaches exist now, especially if you're creating a Glimmer component from the start. If you think of why they're there, it doesn't make sense to use them. So one final thought, we're talking about a paradigm shift here. We're not thinking in terms of component life cycles anymore, which is what render modifiers encourage. We're thinking in terms of encapsulated behavior and reactivity. So think in terms of hooking behavior. Instead of thinking in terms of hooking behavior into various points in a component's life cycle, think in terms of encapsulating that behavior in primitives such as helpers, resources, and modifiers, because these things are reactive. They constrain the responsibility in a nice shareable package, and they're attached to elements within your components. So Preston's written a good blog post on this. This was kind of inspired by that blog post and a lot of the pairing sessions I've had. So if reading blogs is more how you like to ingest information, go and check that out because that's really cool. And thanks, Preston, because it kind of made me not have to think about the code examples as much as I would have thinking about myself. And also Jim Schofield did a great talk at the last Ember Europe about resources more specifically. So if you want to understand more about that and go a bit deeper in there, it's a great one as well. So check that out. Thanks for having me. I'm Aaron, and you can catch me there. And that's all.